The silver needle, threaded with royal scarlet, trembled in Elara's hand. She was mending a long, jagged tear in the king's favourite hunting cloak, the one he'd worn the day her father died. The heavy green wool should have smelled of pine forests and autumn air. But to Elara, it always carried the faint, metallic hint of old blood. She pushed the needle through the fabric, her movements precise, her breathing quiet. To be invisible was to be safe. It was the 17th of Frost month, year 998. 3 years, 2 months, and 14 days since Lord Turin's execution for treason. 3 years, 2 months, and 14 days that his only daughter, Elara, had lived as a servant in the palace of King Leander. She wasn't a prisoner in a cell, but a ghost in the halls. Her world was one of chipped pottery, dusty tapestries, and the endless, silent polishing of silver that wasn't hers. That morning, like every morning, began before dawn. Elara's small room under the eastern stairs was always cold. The stone wall felt damp against her palm when she woke. She dressed in her plain grey dress, the wool scratchy against her skin, and tied her brown hair back tightly. Her day was a map of duties. Clear the ashes from the great hall's 3 fireplaces, polish the 12 sconces along the royal gallery, and mend the king's clothing. She moved through the bustling palace like a shadow. The cooks shouted in the kitchen, guards laughed by the gates, but no one truly saw Elara. That was the point. Her first task was to clean the king's private council chamber after his early meeting. The room, called the sunroom for its tall, east-facing windows, was warm and stuffy. The smell of strong coffee and men's perfume hung in the air. She began methodically, gathering empty cups onto a tray, her soft cloth wiping away rings of moisture from the dark oak table. She was smoothing the wrinkles from a large map when she noticed it. A piece of parchment, no bigger than her thumb, caught in the iron grate of the fireplace. It must have fallen and been missed by the fire. Elara glanced at the door. It was closed. Her heart did a little skip against her ribs. She knelt, pretending to adjust her shoe, and plucked the scrap from the grate. It was brittle, its edge charred black. On it, pressed into the wax that had once sealed a letter, was the top half of her father's seal, the head of a stag. And below it, written in hurried, charcoal-smudged handwriting, were 3 words, asterisk, only the cipher, asterisk. A chill, colder than her morning room, slipped down her spine. The cipher. Her father had muttered about ciphers in his study, late at night. He'd shown her little puzzles when she was small, games of symbols and swap letters. She'd forgotten. She'd forced herself to forget so much. The sound of the door handle turning made her jump. She shoved the parchment scrap deep into the pocket of her dress, her fingers feeling like ice. The rest of the day passed in a blur of normal chores, but nothing felt normal. The words echoed in her mind. Asterisk only the cipher. Asterisk when she polished the silver. Her own wide, fearful eyes looked back at her from the surface of a soup ladle. The usual sounds of the palace, the clang of the blacksmith's hammer, the distant melody of a minstrel practicing, seemed sharper, more urgent. She felt as if she were carrying a lit candle through a room full of old tapestries, terrified one wrong move would set everything ablaze. As evening fell, painting the sky in shades of violet and deep blue, her final duty took her to the great hall. A visiting lord had been overly generous with his wine goblet, and a dark red puddle had stained the flagstones near the high table. Elara got down on her knees with a bucket of soapy water and a rough brush. The stone was hard and unforgiving under her knees. The smell of vinegar and wine mixed unpleasantly. She scrubbed, lost in the rhythmic motion and the whirl of her own thoughts. That's when the shadow fell over her. Then, a boot, polished to a mirror shine, came down squarely on top of her cleaning rag, pinning it to the stone. Elara froze. She didn't need to look up to know who it was. She had polished those boots herself. "Look at me." The voice was low, calm, and it made every hair on her arm stand up. Slowly, Elara raised her head. King Leander stood above her. He was a tall man, with hair the color of wheat and eyes like a winter sky. He was dressed for dinner in a deep blue tunic, but his expression was not one of a man heading to a feast. In his hand, he held a slender dagger, its point glinting in the torchlight. He didn't threaten her with it. Instead, he used the cold, flat tip of the blade to gently lift her chin, forcing her to meet his gaze. Up close, she could smell the spiced wine on his breath, and the sweet, nutty scent of the almonds he was always eating. His eyes searched her face, looking for something. "Do you pray for my death, little ghost?" The question hung in the air between them. Elara's mouth went completely dry. She could hear the blood rushing in her ears. She could feel the tiny, jagged piece of parchment in her pocket, like a piece of live coal. What was the right answer? The true answer? In that moment, she didn't know what she prayed for. She only knew she wanted to be back in her cold, quiet room under the stairs. Before she could even form a word, the world exploded. It started with a sound so deep and loud it was more a feeling than a noise, a crunch of splintering oak from the direction of the west gate. It was followed instantly by a chorus of shouts, not the orderly calls of the guards changing watch, but sharp, panicked yells of alarm. Then came the smell. It cut through the whole smells of food and rushes, a sharp, resinous, smoky scent. Pine pitch. The scent used to fire siege engines and torches. King Leander's head snapped toward the sound. The dagger at Elara's chin wavered, then fell away. His face transformed from cold curiosity to razor-focused command. "To arms!" he roared, a voice that filled the vast hall, and he was suddenly running, his blue tunic a blur. Elara remained on her knees, the wet rag still trapped under the ghost weight of his boot. The midnight bell began to toll, a deep, shuddering gong that vibrated through the stone floor and into her bones. With each boom, she saw the wine dregs in a forgotten cup on the table tremble. Chaos was no longer a distant possibility. It was here, in her home, in the air she breathed. And as the sounds of battle grew closer, the clash of steel, the terrible thud of heavy objects hitting the outer walls, Elara knew one thing. The life of a ghost, the safety of invisibility, was over. The question now was what would rise from the ashes to take its place. Sometimes, friends, our quiet worlds are shattered in an instant. We find ourselves on our knees, facing a storm we never asked for. But in those terrifying moments of change, something important happens. We are forced to look up. We are forced to see clearly for the first time. And that, even in the midst of fear, is the beginning of everything. The king's dagger was gone, but its cold touch seemed to linger on Elara's skin. The thunderous crash from the gates still echoed in the stone around her. For a long second, she just stayed there, on her knees on the damp flagstone, her mind perfectly blank, like a lake frozen solid. Then, the world rushed in. The great hall, so grand and empty a moment before, became a river of panic motion. Servants ran in from the kitchen, their faces white with flour and fear. 2 guards in chainmail sprinted past, their boots slapping hard against the floor, the sound ringing in the huge space. From outside, the noises were a storm of their own. Men shouting in anger and pain, the sharp asterisk twang asterisk of crossbows firing, and that awful, rhythmic asterisk thud 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 asterisk of heavy objects hitting the outer wall. Each impact sent a faint shiver up through the stones beneath Elara's hands. Her body moved before her mind could catch up. A deep, old instinct took over. She scrambled to her feet, her wet dress clinging to her knees. Everyone was running asterisk toward asterisk the servants' quarters, deeper into the palace's heart, where the walls were thickest. Safety lay that way. But Elara's feet didn't turn. Instead, they carried her in the opposite direction, down a narrow, shadowy corridor lined with tapestries showing hunting scenes. She wasn't thinking of the king, or the rebels, or even the scrap of paper in her pocket. She was thinking of her father. 10 years ago, on a rainy afternoon, he had taken her by the hand. "Every great house needs its secrets, little stag," he'd whispered, his eyes sparkling. He'd shown her how the third tapestry from the end, the one of a hunter facing a giant bear, hid a seam in the stone wall. A gentle push right there, where the bear's paw met the ground, and a section of wall would swing inward just enough for a person to slip through. She hadn't thought of that in years. She had buried the memory deep, along with all the other happy ones. But now, with the smell of smoke getting stronger, her muscles remembered. She found the tapestry. The fabric was dusty under her fingers. She pressed the woven bear's paw. Nothing happened. Her heart sank. It had been a child's game. A fantasy. She leaned her forehead against the cold stone, a wave of hopelessness washing over her. Then, with a soft, grating sigh of stone on stone, the hidden door gave way, swinging inward an inch. A puff of cold, stale air brushed her face. The passage inside was tight and black as ink. She squeezed through, pulling the door closed behind her. The roaring chaos of the palace muted instantly, replaced by the sound of her own ragged breathing and the scuff of her shoes on gritty stone. She had no torch, no candle. She inched forward, one hand on the damp wall to guide her. She counted her steps, just as her father had taught her. 27 steps, then a left turn where the air smelled of old books. This passage led to the library's second-floor gallery, a hidden balcony overlooking the main room. A lattice of carved wood screened it from view below. Elara crouched there, peering through the gaps. The library was in disarray. Several rebels in mismatched leather armor were ransacking the place, not for gold, but for papers. They pulled books from shelves, shaking them, tossing them aside. Her chest ached. Those books were friends. Nothing here. Just dusty old tales. One called out, "Check the solar next. The king's maps will be there." Another yelled back. They clattered out. The room fell silent, save for the distant battle sounds. Elara knew where the solar was. It was the king's private planning room, next to the army. An idea, dangerous and clear, formed in her mind. She couldn't fight with a sword. She was just a girl everyone had forgotten. But she could *see star. And she could *take star. Getting to the army was a journey through a broken dream. The beautiful hallways she cleaned every day were now strewn with fallen banners and broken glass. The smell of pine smoke was everywhere now, mixed with the sharp, coppery scent that made her stomach twist. She tried not to look at the shapes on the floor, focusing instead on the chipped blue paint on a doorframe, the single yellow shoe on a stair. The armory door was already hanging off its hinges. Inside, the scene was one of organized chaos. Rebels were arming themselves, grabbing swords and shields from the racks. In a corner, a man was groaning, a friend wrapping a cloth around his arm. No one noticed the grey shadow that slipped along the far wall. Her eyes found what she was looking for. Not weapons, but a plain wooden table against the back wall, under a high, barred window. It was a campaign table, littered with scroll cases, inkpots, and stacks of parchment, the king's military dispatches. A rebel soldier stood nearby, his back to her, trying on a helmet that was too big. This was her irreversible choice. She could slip away, find a closet to hide in until it was all over. Or she could cross this floor, in full view, and take from the table. Taking a breath that tasted of metal and smoke, Elara moved. She didn't run. She walked, calmly, as if she belonged there, over to the table. She grabbed a runner satchel, a leather messenger's bag, from the back of a chair. Without looking, she swept armfuls of the parchment and scrolls from the table into the bag. The papers rustled like dry leaves. "Hey!" The shout cut through the noise. The soldier with the big helmet had turned. He was a big man with a red beard, his eyes narrow. "You! What are you doing?" Elara froze. The heavy satchel clutched her chest. Her voice was gone, trapped in her throat. The man strode over, snatching the bag from her. He appended it, and the precious papers spilled out onto the stone floor in a messy waterfall. He looked from the papers to her plain grey dress, to her face. Recognition dawned in his eyes, and it was not kind. "The traitor's whelp steals too," he sneered, his voice loud enough for others to turn and look. "Figures. Rat father, rat daughter." The words should have hurt, but a strange calm settled over Elara. She was tired of being a ghost. She looked past his shoulder, through the armory door and across the hall into the solar. There, surrounded by 3 rebel soldiers, was King Leander. His fine blue tunic was torn and smudged with dirt. A cut on his forehead bled a thin line down the side of his face. He was being held, but he was standing tall, his gaze sweeping the room. And his gaze landed on her. It moved from her face, to the rebel holding her, to the sea of official papers scattered at their feet. His eyes, those winter sky eyes, widened for just a fraction of a second. Not in anger. In calculation. In understanding. In that moment, Elara understood something too. The rebel saw her as a symbol of her father's shame, to be despised. The king, in that swift, silent look, saw her as something else. A piece on the board. A player in the game. The red-bearded man shoved her aside. Lock her in the scullery with the others. We'll deal with her later. As two rebels grabbed her arms, she kept her eyes on the king. He gave the smallest, almost invisible nod. Nod of friendship. Of acknowledgement. The 9-hour siege ended as dawn broke. The fighting had moved to the outer walls and then stopped. From a small, high window in the scullery where she was held with the other kitchen staff, Elara watched the sky lighten from black to grey to a pale, sickly yellow, thick with smoke. The sound that marked the end was not a cheer, but the ragged, hungry cawing of crows, hundreds of them, descending on the field beyond the walls. Later, when the rebels sorted through their spoils, the papers she had tried to take were brought before their captain in the great hall. Elara was dragged before him too. He was a stern man named Kale, with tired eyes. He held up one of the maps, then looked at the secret parchment scrap they had found in her pocket, the one with the stag seal and the words asterisk only the cipher star. He laid them side by side on the high table. On the margin of the king's own map of the northern fortresses, drawn in the same ink as the troop markings, was that same phrase, asterisk only the cipher star. And next to it, a small, hastily drawn symbol. It was the king's personal mark, one she'd seen 1,000 times on orders and seals. But now, with her father's broken seal in her mind, she saw it clearly. It was not an original design. It was her father's proud stag, but altered, its antlers twisted into a different, sharper shape. The public traitor was her father. But this mark, this cipher, the true betrayal, she realized with a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air, was still wearing a crown. Have you ever been completely misunderstood? Seen only for where you come from, and not for who you are? Elara was trapped in that painful space. But friends, here's the beautiful thing about hitting a wall. It forces you to look for a door, a window, a hidden seam in the stone you never noticed before. Sometimes, the moment we feel most lost is when we finally begin to find our true direction. The key is to keep looking, even in the dark. The door to the oubliette didn't open. It fell away. One moment, Elara was standing in the grey light of the scullery, her arms sore from being held. The next, a heavy hand pushed her forward into utter blackness. There was no stair, just a short drop. She landed on a floor of wet, uneven stone, the impact jolting her ankles and sending her sprawling. The door above slammed shut with a final, echoing asterisk thud asterisk, and the blackness became complete. It was a black so thick it felt solid, pressing against her eyes. She was back in the place where her father had spent his last days. The air was cold and damp, smelling of wet earth, of stone that had never seen the sun, and underneath it all, a faint, sour smell of old fear. It was the smell of forgotten things. Elara lay still for a long time, her breath coming in short, sharp gasps that sounded terribly loud in the silence. She could feel the chill of the stone seeping through her grey dress, into her skin, into her bones. Time stopped having meaning. There was no sunrise here, no bell to mark the hours. She measured it by the pounding of her heart, and by the slow, steady asterisk drip, 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 asterisk of water from somewhere in the darkness. Each drop landed in a small puddle with a soft, lonely plink. She crawled to the wall, her hands feeling the slimy, cold stone until she found a corner. She pulled her knees to her chest, trying to make herself small. The silence was worse than the shouts of battle. In the silence, she could hear every thought in her head, and they were not kind thoughts. She was not the brave girl from the stories. She was a ghost who had tried to stop being a ghost, and now she was in a hole in the ground. She had spent 3 years polishing the silver of the man who had killed her father. She had kept her head down. She had survived by being invisible. That was her truth. That was her flaw. She was a creature of silence and shadows, and now the shadows had swallowed her whole. She must have slept, or something like it, because the sound of the door opening again was a shock that made her whole body jerk. A shaft of dim torchlight stabbed the darkness, so bright it hurt her eyes. 2 figures were shoved down into the pit. The first landed hard and didn't move. The second stumbled, caught himself, and then slowly, painfully, sat up against the opposite wall. The door slammed shut again, but the rebels had left a single, sputtering torch wedged in a crack near the opening above. It cast a flickering, jumpy light, painting the small cell in moving shadows. Elara squinted. The man who had sat up was King Leander. His fine clothes were ruined, torn and stained. The cut on his forehead had dried into a dark, ugly line. He was breathing heavily, one arm held awkwardly against his side. The other figure, a young guard in royal colours, lay motionless. The king looked at the guard, his face grim, then his gaze found Elara in her corner. He didn't look like a king anymore. He looked like a tired, hurt man trapped in a hole. 4 hours, they didn't speak. The torchlight slowly burned down. The king's breathing grew more ragged, and a flush of fever touched his cheeks. Elara watched him, this man who was the center of her world, the source of all her fear and loss. She should hate him. She thought she did. But seeing him shiver on the filthy stone, she felt a confusing pinch in her chest that wasn't hate. "They will kill you at dawn," the king said suddenly. His voice was hoarse, but it cut through the drip of the water. Kale, their captain, is a fair man, but he cannot let a rival king live. It's the way of things. Elara said nothing. She knew it was true. He turned his head, his eyes glinting in the low light. "They will kill you, too. Not because you are a threat. Because you are a symbol. My mercy, or my lingering guilt, made flesh. They will see it as weakness to be erased." The cold in Elara's bones deepened. "I have a proposal," he whispered. The fever was growing in him. She could see it in the too bright shine of his eyes. "In my boot. The left one. There is a piece of parchment." Hesitantly, Elara crawled across the cold floor. She avoided looking at the still guard. She touched the king's boot, and he flinched. Carefully, she worked a folded, stiff piece of parchment from inside. It was a single sheet, covered in rows of symbols, letters, numbers, strange little drawings of birds and swords. At the top was the drawn symbol she'd seen on the map, the twisted stag, the king's mark. "It is a cipher. A code," he said, each word an effort. "The messages hidden within, they are the proof of everything. Your father found part of it. He confronted me with it. He thought I was betraying the kingdom." The king closed his eyes for a moment, gathering strength. He was right to be angry, but he was wrong about the traitor. He explained in broken sentences. The cipher was a tool, used by a shadowy group inside the kingdom's council to sell secrets to the neighboring realm of Valen. The twisted stag was their signal. Her father, Lord Turin, had intercepted one message. He had stormed into the throne room, accusing the king. But before Turin could reveal the full proof, before he could decode the rest, the true traitors had acted. They produced forged letters, made it seem as if Turin himself was the spy. The king, blinded by what seemed like clear evidence and pressure from his own advisers, had acted in swift, terrible judgment. "I thought I was stopping a betrayal," the king murmured, his head leaning back against the stone. "But I was silencing the one man who could have shown me the truth." He looked at Elara, his gaze sharp even through the fever. "You are your father's daughter. He told me once he taught you his little puzzle games. The way his mind worked, it is in you. I saw it when you looked at that map in the army. You saw it." He coughed, a dry, painful sound. "Help me. Decode this. Find the names hidden in this cipher. The proof of who really did this. Do that, and I will give you more than your life. I will give you your father's name back. I will give you the truth." Elara stared at the parchment in her hands. The symbols swam before her eyes. This was the impossible choice. She could refuse. She could let the fever take him, Let the rebels end them both at dawn. She could die as the traitor's daughter, and let her father's true story die with her. Or she could trust the man who had ordered his death. She could use the very skill her father had lovingly taught her, the skill of seeing patterns in chaos, to save the man who had destroyed her life. The silence stretched, broken only by the drip of water and the king's labored breath. She looked from the cryptic parchment to his face. The hatred she expected to feel had crumbled, leaving behind a vast, empty space filled with a single, aching need to know what really happened. His voice was so quiet she almost didn't hear it. He wasn't plotting against me. And then, Elara realized her father's treason was a lie. A great, heavy weight she had carried for 3 years cracked and began to fall away. He didn't die because he was evil. He died because he was loyal. He died trying to save the very kingdom that now called him a traitor. The truth wasn't a comfort. It was a new kind of pain, sharp and clean. But it was her truth. And she would cling to it. She wiped her dirty hands on her dress and moved closer to the failing torchlight. She smoothed the parchment on the driest stone she could find. She looked at the first line of symbols, and she didn't see nonsense. She saw her father's study. She saw him laughing, handing her a piece of paper with a silly riddle. Look for what repeats, little stag. Listen to the silence between the letters. Her finger traced the first symbol. It was beginning. You know, friends, we all carry weights we didn't choose. Stories about ourselves that others have written for us. You're not strong enough. You're defined by your past. You're just a background character in someone else's story. But here's the incredible thing about truth. It waits for you. Even in the darkest, coldest places, it waits. And when you finally find it, it doesn't always fix everything. But it gives you solid ground to stand on. It gives you your own story back. And that is always the first, bravest step forward. The sound in the oubliette changed. It was no longer just the drip, 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 or asterisk of distant water. It was the soft, scratchy sound of charcoal on stone. Elara knelt on the cold floor, the king's feverish cipher parchment before her. With a piece of charcoal she'd found in a corner, she was writing on the wall itself, her fingers blackened, her mind a world away. She didn't see the damp stone. She saw her father's library, sun streaming through the window, dust motes dancing in the air as he smiled. Look for the bird, she whispered to herself, her voice raspy from disuse. The cipher used symbols. A bird wasn't a bird, it was the letter F for fly. A sword wasn't a sword, it was a C for cut. Her father's childhood games had been lessons in disguise. The twisted stag symbol was the key. It told you to shift every letter 3 spaces back in the alphabet. A simple code, but hidden inside a web of pretty drawings. As she worked, letter by letter, a new world emerged from the symbols. It wasn't a world of battles, but of secrets. Lists of supply routes for grain and iron. Dates for royal patrols along the northern border. Numbers that could only be prices. And names. Always names. Shipment to be received by contact at the Grey Harbour Inn, she murmured, the words taking shape on the stone wall. King Leander watched from his corner, wrapped in silence. His fever had broken after the first day, thanks to a flask of water and a crust of mouldy bread a guard reluctantly dropped down to them. He said nothing, just watched Elara transform. The timid ghost was gone. In her place was a girl with fierce, focused eyes, her brow furrowed, talking to the wall in a low, steady stream. She was using her invisibility, her silence, not to hide, but as a tool to uncover what was hidden. By the time the door opened on the 3rd morning, Elara had decoded 2 full messages. She quickly scrubbed the most damning words from the wall with her sleeve, leaving only smudges. They were pulled from the oubliette, blinking in the harsh grey light of the courtyard. The rebel captain, Kale, looked them over. He saw a broken king and a dirty servant girl. The girl is useful in the kitchens, King Leander said, his voice flat. She knows where the winter root cellar is. Your men will need to eat. Kale eyed him, then shrugged. Fine. But you, He pointed to the king. Go to the stone cell. No more comforts. It was a bargain, unspoken but clear. Elara was given a tiny room in the servants' quarters again, not as a prisoner, but as a worker. She had become the king's reclaimed asset, and she began the most dangerous game of her life. To the rebels, she was just Elara, quiet and efficient. She swept the halls they now occupied. She sorted through the palace's stores, counting sacks of flour and wheels of cheese. She was a piece of the furniture, a grey mouse they forgot was there. But her eyes and ears were wide open. She listened to the rebel soldiers grumble about their leaders. She noticed which of the captured royal advisors walked a little too freely through the halls, speaking a little too warmly with Captain Kale. And she decoded. At night, by the light of a single tallow candle that smelled of burnt fat, she worked on the rest of the cipher. The messages revealed a plot that was cold and calculated. The northern fortresses were to be left undermanned. Key bridges were to be in need of repair when the Valish army moved. It was a plan to weaken the kingdom from within, making it easy to conquer. And the man at the center of the web, the one using the king's own twisted stag seal? It was Lord Borden, the king's own master of coin, a man with a kind smile and a laugh that filled a room. A man who had testified passionately against her father. Elara stored every decoded fact, every name, like a weapon in her mind. She fed the king just enough information in their brief, stolen moments, a whisper while passing in a corridor, a folded note left under a bowl in the scullery, to keep his trust. She told him about supply routes, but not about Borden. She gave him numbers, but not the full list of names. She was hoarding the truth, building her own power. The days turned into weeks. The first snow fell, dusting the shattered battlements with white, muffling the sounds of the occupied palace. Elara's hands grew rough from work, but her mind was sharper than any blade in the army. The meeting was set for the winter solstice, the shortest day of the year. Captain Kale had called a parley. He knew holding a kingdom was harder than seizing it. He needed legitimacy, or at least, a truce. The great throne room, where Elara had once scrubbed floors, was chosen. High noon. The week solstice sun streamed through the tall windows, the coloured glass throwing fractured patches of red and blue light on the stone floor. Elara entered at the king's heel, dressed in a clean but simple grey dress, her head bowed. She looked every bit the subdued servant. King Leander walked with a show of dignity, though his clothes were plain. On a central table lay the documents of proposed terms. Arrayed around were Kale, his 2 lieutenants, and 3 of the captured royal advisors. Among them, smiling gently, was Lord Borden. The talk began. Kale spoke of fair rule, of restoring order. King Leander spoke of tradition and stability. It was a dance of words. Lord Borden leaned in, the perfect peacemaker. Perhaps a shared council, he suggested, his voice smooth as honey. We must all think of the kingdom's future, not the wounds of the past. Elara stood perfectly still, her hands folded. She watched Borden's face, the concern in his eyes, the way his fingers brushed the king's arm reassuringly. She saw the ghost of her father in that moment, storming into this very room, seeing the same performance, and crying out the truth that no one would believe. The king was reaching a crucial point, talking of loyalty and the true hearts of his subjects. He was about to agree to a council that would include Borden. It was the traitor's victory, wrapped in a flag of peace. That's when Elara took one small step forward. It was a tiny movement, but in the quiet room, it drew every eye. She reached into the deep pocket of her dress and pulled out a sheaf of parchment, her life's work, the fully decoded messages. She didn't hand them to the king. She placed them firmly on the table, right on top of Kale's proposed treaty. "The seal is yours, your grace," she said. Her voice was clear and calm, and it cut through the polite conversation like a bell. For a moment, there was utter silence. King Leander looked at her, confusion in his eyes. Lord Borden's gentle smile froze. Elara pointed a finger, not at the king, but at the top parchment. There, she had neatly redrawn the cipher's secret, the king's twisted stag seal, and next to it, her father's original, unbroken stag. Below it, in her careful handwriting, were the decoded words, Payment confirmed for the northern pass. Ensure the king's patrols are diverted by the false report of bandits. Obey. She looked directly at Lord Borden. The seal was changed after my father's death. Wasn't it, my lord? You had to make sure any future messages looked like they came from the king, and not from you. But you kept the old cipher. A mistake. Borden's face went from waxen to furious red. This is nonsense. The lies of a traitor's child, desperate for revenge. But Captain Kale was already picking up the papers. His eyes, trained for detail, scanned the lines. He saw the lists, the dates, the prices. He saw a second letter, decoded, that mentioned a friend in the rebel camp who would ensure Kale himself fell in the first attack on the gate. His own betrayal. The king was staring at Elara, a storm of emotions on his face, shock, dawning understanding, and a fierce, proud light. He opened his mouth to speak, but Lord Borden moved. His hand shot to the boot of the rebel lieutenant beside him, pulling a dagger from its hidden sheath. His kindly mask was gone, replaced by the snarling face of a man who had just lost everything. "You ruinous little rat," he screamed, not at the king, but at Elara. And then he lunged. The solstice sun glinted on the dagger's point. Kale shouted. The king surged forward. But Elara, who had spent a lifetime learning to be still, didn't move. She just watched the blade come, her heart a silent, steady drum in her chest. Have you ever had a moment where you had to stand your ground? Where everything you'd learned, everything you'd suffered, came down to one single, still point? It's terrifying. Your whole body screams to run, to hide, to go back to being invisible. But there's something stronger. It's the weight of truth. It's the love for someone you lost. It's the future you're choosing, right there in front of everyone. In those seconds, you are more than your past. You are a force. You are a fire. And no one can ever put that light out. The dagger never reached her. It stopped in midair, caught in the iron grip of Captain Kale's hand. The rebel leader's face was like a thundercloud. He twisted Borden's wrist until the blade clattered to the stone floor, its noise shockingly loud in the silent throne room. In that moment, the room wasn't divided between rebel and royal. It was divided between those who had been lied to and the man who had done the lying. What followed wasn't a battle, but an unraveling. Lord Borden, spitting and frantic, named other names: a royal guardsman, a tax collector from the southern provinces, a merchant who supplied the Valish army with wool. With each confession, the web of the true betrayal became visible to everyone. King Leander stood very still, watching the man he had trusted for 20 years come apart at the seams. The look on his face was one of the deepest, quietest sorrow Elara had ever seen. The rebellion ended not with a sword, but with a shared purpose. Captain Kale and King Leander spent the rest of that solstice day and long into the night in the sun room, talking. Elara was asked to be there, to explain the cipher, to show the proof. She did so, her voice steady, pointing to the decoded messages with a charcoal-stained finger. She was no longer a servant or a ghost. She was the key that had unlocked the truth. The winter that followed was a time of slow, careful mending. The rebel soldiers who had fought honestly were offered pardons and a place in a new, unified royal guard. Captain Kale was given a lordship and command of the rebuilt northern fortresses. The palace itself was repaired, stone by stone. The smell of fresh-cut pine from the new timbers slowly replaced the memory of smoke. For Elara, everything changed, and yet, the most important part of her remained. She refused a lavish chamber in the royal wing. Instead, she asked for the old, sun-drenched apartment that had once been her father's library study. It had a small sleeping nook and shelves that reached the ceiling. Here, she built a new life, not as a princess, but as something the kingdom had never seen before. King Leander, on the first day of the new year, stood before the entire reassembled court in the Great Hall. He spoke of Lord Turin's loyalty, of his brave attempt to expose a cancer in the kingdom, and of the great wrong that had been done. He restored the Turin family name, lands, and titles. But when he turned to Elara, he offered her something else. "A title cannot give you what you have already earned," he said, his voice echoing. "You have a keen eye and a mind that sees what others wish to hide. I would have you use it. Will you serve as my spy mistress? As the keeper of truths?" The court gasped. A woman, and so young, in such a role? It was unheard of. Elara, standing in a simple blue dress, felt every eye upon her. She thought of the dark oubliette, of the terror that had once frozen her in this very hall. Then she nodded. "I will, Your Grace." 2 years flowed by, as steady as a river. The kingdom found a fragile peace. Elara's work was quiet. She trained a small network of listeners, a baker who heard gossip, a riverboat captain who saw strange cargo, a scribe with a perfect memory. She taught them not just to hear, but to listen for patterns, for the tiny cracks in a story. She spent hours in her study, now filled with maps and ledgers, the morning light painting warm squares on the wooden floor. The room always smelled of paper, ink, and the lavender she kept in a bowl on the desk. One morning in late frost month, exactly 3 years after the siege, a hard frost glittered on the palace gardens like a million scattered diamonds. Elara walked the high southern battlement, the one that overlooked the training yards and the forest beyond. The air was crisp and clean, stinging her cheeks pleasantly. In her hands, she carried the old, green hunting cloak. She stopped at her favorite spot, where the stone was worn smooth by generations of guards. Below, she saw the New Valish ambassador walking briskly across the courtyard, heading to a meeting about trade routes. He was a nervous man, always fiddling with the buttons on his expensive coat. Today, he wore bright yellow shoes that peeked out from under his fur-trimmed robe. He kept glancing up at the battlements, his eyes scanning. He didn't see Elara, standing still in the shadow of a tower, but he felt watched. Her network had already reported his secret meetings with a disgruntled or merchant. It was a small thing, easily handled with a changed tariff and a warning. The peace would hold. She unfolded the cloak. The long, jagged tear she had mended on that fateful day was now covered by an embroidery of her own design. She had taken the original, clumsy scarlet stitches out. Over many quiet evenings, she had replaced them with silver thread. She hadn't hidden the tear. She had transformed it. The silver threads formed the proud, graceful head of a stag, her father's symbol, clean and clear and unbroken. It was no longer a repair. It was a declaration. The stone of the battlement was warm where the weak winter sun touched it, but cold and rough in the shadow. She pulled the cloak around her shoulders. The wool was heavy, familiar. It smelled faintly of cedar from the chest she kept it in, and no longer of blood or smoke. Its weight was not a burden, but an anchor. The soft scuff of a boot on stone made her turn. A young woman, Maya, one of her newest recruits, approached. She was the daughter of the palace cook, with sharp eyes and a perfect memory for numbers. She leaned close, her breath making a small cloud in the cold air. "A report from the border post, my lady," Maya whispered. "The cipher has changed." Elara didn't show any surprise. She simply nodded, her fingers reaching up to absently trace the raised silver threads of the stag on her cloak. "Good," she said softly. "Send the usual instructions to our listeners, and bring the new cipher patterns to my study afternoon. We'll begin work on it today." Maya nodded, a flicker of excitement in her eyes, and hurried away. Elara turned back to the view. The kingdom stretched out before her, not perfect, but healing. The man with the yellow shoes disappeared into a doorway. From the kitchens, the comforting smell of baking bread began to rise. Somewhere in the forest, a lone bird sang a clear, cold song. She stood there for a long time, a silent, watchful figure woven into the very stone of the palace. The scar of the past was not hidden away in a chest. She wore it openly, transformed into a thing of strength and beauty. It was a reminder, to herself and to everyone, of the cost of truth, and of its even greater power. The girl who had been a ghost was now a pillar. And she was home. You know, friends, our past doesn't just disappear. The difficult chapters, the tears, the moments we thought would never get through, they leave a mark. But here's the secret. We get to decide what that mark means. We can see it as an ugly wound, something to hide. Or we can do what Elara did. We can take the threads of our experience, the strength we learned, the empathy we gained, the truth we fought for, and we can weave something new over that old tear. We can create a pattern that is uniquely, beautifully ours. Your past is part of your story, but it is not the whole book. You are the author of the next chapter. So pick up your needle and your silver thread. The most beautiful part is always yet to come.